The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Special Problems in the Study of Sufi Ideas by Idries Shah. Forms of Sufi activity. What else do the Sufis teach? How do they do so? And what special problems does this study pose for those who would wish to learn from a reputable source of the ideas? The Sufis state that there is a form of knowledge which can be attained by man, which is of such an order that it is to scholastic learning as adulthood is to infancy. Compare, for instance, Al-Ghazali. A child has no real knowledge of the attainments of an adult. An ordinary adult cannot understand the attainments of a learned man. In the same way, a learned man cannot understand the experiences of enlightened saints or Sufis. This, for a start, is not a concept which would instantly commend itself to the scholar. This is no new problem. In the 11th century, Muhammad al-Ghazali, or Al-Ghazal, who saved the Muslim theologians by interpreting Islamic material in such a way as to defeat the attack of Greek philosophy, informed scholastics that their mode of knowledge was inferior to that gained through Sufi practice. They made him into their hero, and their successors still teach his interpretations as orthodox Islam, in spite of his stating that the academic method is insufficient and inferior to real knowledge. Then there was Rumi, the great mystic and poet, who told his audiences that, like a good host, he gave them poetry because they demanded it, providing what was asked for. But, he continued, poetry was tripe compared with a certain high development of the individual. Nearly 700 years later, he could still sting people with this kind of remark. Not long ago, a reviewer in a reputable British newspaper was so affronted by this passage, which he found in a translation, that he said, in effect, Rumi may think that poetry is tripe. I think that his poetry is tripe in this translation. But Sufi ideas, in being put in this manner, are never intended to challenge the man, only to provide him with a higher aim, to maintain his conception that there may be some function of the mind which produced, for instance, the Sufi giants. Inevitably, the contentious collide with this idea. It is because of the prevalence of this reaction that Sufis say that people do not, in fact, want the knowledge that Sufism claims to be able to impart. They really seek only their own satisfactions within their own system of thinking. But the Sufi insists, a short time in the presence of the friends, the Sufis, is better than 100 years' sincere, obedient dedication. Rumi. Sufism also states that man may become objective, and that objectivity enables the individual to grasp higher facts. Man is therefore invited to try to push his evolution ahead towards what is sometimes called in Sufism real intellect. Sufis contend that, far from this law being available in books, a great part of it must be personally communicated by means of an interaction between the teacher and the learner. Too much attention to the written page, they insist, can even be harmful. Here is a further problem, for it appears to oppose the scholar no less than the member of the vast modern literate community who feels, if at times only subconsciously, that all knowledge must surely be available in books. Yet Sufis have worked long and hard to adapt the written word to convey certain parts of what they teach. This has led to the use of manipulated and enciphered materials, not designed especially or always to conceal a real meaning, but intended to show, when decoded, that what on its outward face seemed like a complete poem, myth, treatise, and so on, is susceptible of another interpretation, a sort of demonstration analogous to a kaleidoscopic effect. And when Sufis draw diagrams for such purposes as these, imitators merely tend to copy them and use them at their own levels of understanding. Another Sufi technique provides a further problem. Many Sufic passages, even whole books or series of assertions, are designed to stimulate thought, even sometimes by the method of arousing healthy criticism. These documents are only too often taken by their literalist students as faithful renderings of beliefs held by their original authors. In the West in general, we have plenty of translations. Mostly they are literal renderings of only one facet of multidimensional texts. Western students actually know that the internal dimensions exist, but they have not yet applied them to any extent in their work. To be fair, it must be said that some have admitted that they cannot do this. Another Sufi idea, producing a problem which many have found it impossible to integrate in their minds, is the Sufi insistence that Sufism can be taught in many guises. Sufis, in a word, do not stick to any one convention. Some quite happily use a religious format, others romantic poetry. Some deal in jokes, tales, and legends, yet others rely on art forms and the products of artisanship. Now, a Sufi can tell from his experience that all these presentations are legitimate. But the literalist outsider, however sincere he may be, will often testily demand to be told whether these Sufis, or this and that group of Sufis, are alchemists, members of guilds, religious maniacs, humorists, scientists, or what. This problem, while it may be special to Sufism, is by no means new. Sufis have been judicially murdered, hounded out of their homes, or had their books burnt for using non-religious or locally unacceptable formulations. Some of the greatest Sufi classical authors have been accused of heresy, apostasy, even political crimes. And today they still come under fire from all kinds of committed circles, not just religious ones. The best-known case is that of Hussein ibn Mansur el-Hallaj, the great Sufi martyr, dismembered alive and done to death, his corpse then being burnt by the order of the Caliph el-Muqtadir of the house of Harun al-Rashid in the year 922, for allegedly claiming that he was God. The great teacher Surawadi, too, was executed for teaching ancient philosophy in the 12th century. Even a cursory examination of reputed origins in Sufism will reveal that, although Sufis claim that Sufism is an esoteric teaching within Islam, with which it is therefore regarded as entirely compatible, it also stands behind formulations which many people consider to be quite different from one another. Hence, while the chain of transmission of named teachers extends back to the Prophet Muhammad in this or that line of attribution used by a school or teacher, it may also be referred to, by the same authorities, as stemming from such as Uwais al-Qarni, died in the 7th century, who never met Muhammad in his life. The authoritative Surawadi, in common with, though much before, the Rosicrucians and others, specifically states that this was a form of wisdom known to and practiced by a succession of sages, including the mysterious ancient Hermes of Egypt. Another individual of no less repute, Ibn el-Farid of the early 13th century, 1181 to 1235, stresses that Sufism lies behind and before systematization, that our wine existed before what you call the grape and the vine, the school and the system. We drank to the mention of the friend intoxicating ourselves even before the creation of the vine. There is no doubt that dervishes, would-be Sufis, have traditionally collected together to study whatever remnants of this teaching they could find, awaiting the moment when an exponent might appear among them and make effective the principles and practices whose active meaning was for them lost. This theory is to be found in the West, of course, in Freemasonry, with its concept of the lost secret. The practice is duly confirmed, for instance, in the textbook Awarif el-Marif, and it has been regarded, by those interested in such things, as an indication of the occurrence of a messianic expectation characteristic in Sufism. However that may be, and it belongs only to a preparatory phase, not to Sufism proper, there is evidence that people in Europe and the Middle East, whatever their psychological commitment of faith, have from time to time been located and inspired in the Sufi doctrines by teachers, sometimes of mysterious origins, who came among them. These people have for centuries been referred to as universal or completed men, insani kamil. Such was the case with Rumi, 13th century, and Shams of Tabriz, of Bahuddin Naqshband, incorrectly but frequently rendered as Naqshband, in the 14th century in Bokhara, of Ibn al-Arabi, who taught in terms of religion, figures of antiquity and love poetry, and of many others less known in Western circles. The problem for the student here may not be whether this irrational form of action or refreshment of a tradition took place or not. It is the psychological difficulty of accepting such people as really having any special function to reunite the beads of mercury, or to reactivate, awaken the inner current in man. But we have not even started to enumerate the fields in which Sufis and entities known to have been devised by them, these latter being a minority of the real number, because Sufism is action, not institution, have carried out social, philosophical, and other forms of action in the past 1,000 years. Characters as seemingly diverse as the forthright Rumi, the saintly Chishti, the god-intoxicated Hallaj, the statesmen of the Mujaddids, have worked for centuries to further the actual reunification of communities seemingly irrevocably parted. For their pains, and again assessed by the inadequate and often inaccurate standards of their commentators, these people have been accused of being secret Christians, Jews, Hindus, apostates, and sun worshippers. When the Bektashis used the number 12 and gave, like Arabi and Rumi, Christian myths a high place in their teachings, it was, and still is, assumed that they only were capitalizing on the local abundance of Christians deprived of effective leadership. The validity of this charge awaits the verification of the Sufi answer that Christian and numerous other formulations contain a valuable measure of insights which, under suitable circumstances, can be applied to man. The followers of Haji Bektash, died 1337, were and still are in some places regarded as immoral simply because of their practice of admitting women to their meetings. Nobody could or would understand them when they said that it was necessary to redress the social balance of a society based upon male supremacy. Social reinstatement of women simply sounded, until it recently became a respectable objective, like a cloak for orgies. Nobody of consequence, even in the 19th and early 20th centuries, bothered himself to look at the claim, made by such as the distinguished Turkish Sufi and savant Ziya Gökalp, that Sufi writers centuries ago had outlined and employed theories later identified with the names of Berkeley, Kant, Foulet, Guyot, Nietzsche, and William James. This brings us to another important Sufi projection, one which causes bafflement and even rage in certain types of person, but which should instead be faced. It is the assertion that when Sufic activity becomes concentrated at one point or in one community in a very active and real, not imitation, form, it does so only for a limited time and for distinct purposes. It is the type of person who says, "I want it here and now or not at all," who dislikes this statement. Put in another way, the idea is that no society is ever complete. Neither are its needs exactly the same as those of other societies. No Sufi sets up an institution intended to endure. The outer form in which he imparts his ideas is a transient vehicle designed for local operation. That which is perpetual, he says, is in another range. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.